Welcome everybody to a very special school psych podcast at a little bit of a different time than normal. But my name is Rachel. I'm a school psychologist working in the state of Maryland, and really excited today for this episode. It's going to be a little bit different. A lot of times we have guests on that do presentations and whatnot, and Dr. Reynolds for sure has, does tons of webinars. I'm getting emails all the time about, he's doing a Basque webinar, so we thought that we would be a little bit more informal. We're just kind of chat and take some questions and whatnot. So no real hard outline tonight. So, we definitely want people to chime in and ask questions, and we're just going to chit chat as if, we're just hanging out. So we're all a little bit giddy too, and excited and a little bit starstruck as normal. So, but I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca, who's going to tell us how to participate. Rebecca?
Yes, hello everyone. Good afternoon. The easiest way for you all to participate, if you are watching us live right now on YouTube Live, is to sign into your YouTube account and comment right in the chat box on the right side of the video screen. Also, you can comment on Facebook, on the School Psych, your School Psychologist page, or on the School Psych podcast page. You can comment under the last post or in messages, and I'll be looking for notifications there, as well as on Twitter. I'll be looking for the hashtag #PsychedPodcast. So please feel free to tweet out or shout out your questions on Facebook or comment right alongside of the video that you're watching currently. And I thought I would maybe start off before Eric introduces our wonderful guest with a little quote from Wikipedia that may explain our starstruck nervousness. And that is, today, the most commonly used impact index in academia and other scholarly circles is the H index. An H index of 25, for example, is considered impressive. This value indicates the person has 25 research articles which have been cited a minimum of 25 times. Dr. Reynolds' H index is 54, an unusually impressive value. It is useful to compare his value of 54 with that of other important figures in the history of psychological assessment and measurement. Both Lee J. Cronbach and Ann Anastasi have H index values of 47. This sort of comparison very usefully places Dr. Reynolds' impact into a relevant context and its informative quantitative summary of his outstanding impact as a psychological scientist who is now one of the most prolific and often cited scientists in the profession. So if I'm a little off and odd, this explains why, I hope. And here's Eric.
All right. Well, I am incredibly excited as well. And as we were just signing on, I mentioned to Dr. Reynolds that I had met him at the School Neuropsych conference 2 summers ago, and was, one of those starstruck guys who ran up and asked for a selfie right after the workshop. But the workshop was more important than the picture. But Dr. Reynolds, we're honored to have him here, and Dr. Reynolds, PhD, ABPdN, earned his doctoral degree from the University of Georgia in 1978 under the tutelage of Dr. Alan S. Kaufman, with a major in school psychology and minors in statistics and clinical neuropsychology. He served an internship divided between the Medical College of Georgia and the Rutland Center for Severely Emotionally Disturbed Children. Prior to joining the Texas A&M University faculty in 1981, Dr. Reynolds was a faculty member of the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, where he served as associate director and acting director of the Buros Institute of Mental Measurement after writing grants and proposals to move the institute to Nebraska following the death of its founder, Oscar Buros. His primary research interests are in all aspects of psychological assessment, with particular emphasis on assessment of memory, emotional and affective states and traits, and issues of cultural bias in testing. He's the author of more than 300 scholarly publications and the author or editor of 55 books, including the Handbook of School Psychology, Encyclopedia of Special Education, the Handbook of Clinical Neuropsychology, and he's the author of several widely used tests of personality, behavior, including the Basque, behavior assessment for children, and the revised Children's Manifest Anxiety Scale, and the RIAS, which we'll hopefully discuss more this afternoon. He's also a senior author of the Test of Memory and Learning, and as I mentioned, the Reynolds Intellectual Assessment Scale, and more than 30 other commonly published psychological and neuropsychological tests, and co-author of several computerized test interpretation systems. He is currently practicing forensic neuroscience nationally out of Austin, Texas. So welcome, Dr. Reynolds.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here with you guys. I listened to all that introduction, and I'm wondering, when does this guy sleep?
We wonder too.
Yes. That was one of our questions, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think sleep's overrated.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's so much kind of to ask. I mean, could you tell us, just to start us off, a little bit about kind of your career and how that unfolded and what brought you into psychology, I guess?
Sure. I think I got into psychology, I think, in a way that a significant number of people end up in their areas. I had an undergraduate professor that really inspired me about psychology as a science. And at the time, I was kind of searching for a major that I liked. I had played professional athletics and had an injury that ended my athletic career. And so I went back to college because I didn't know how to earn a living, and thought, well, I'll be a coach and major in PE and that kind of thing. I wanted to work with young folks. And this was way back before they had courses in things like kinesiology and physiology of exercise and things like that. And I found out a lot of the folks majoring in PE were perhaps not as intellectually stimulating as I was looking for. Is that a nice way to say that? But because I was one of them, I think I can get away with that. And a lot of that's changed now, by the way. That coursework is far more demanding than it used to be. And so I started searching around for something else I wanted to major in. I took some business courses and just frankly found those boring, and continued to search, and just happened to take a psychology course with an outstanding professor who convinced me that psychology was a science, and it just took hold from there. And it was very natural, if you wanted to work with kids, to go into school psychology. And I actually was, when I applied to doctoral programs, I actually applied to several programs in clinical child psychology and several programs in school psychology. And Paul Torrance, which is a name that some of your folks will know. Paul Torrance was chair of the Ed Psych department at the University of Georgia. And Paul was known to me from because I had an undergraduate major in psychology. I knew of him and his work, and he was a phenomenal superstar in the field of creativity. And you may have heard of the Torrance test of creative thinking and things like that. And Paul was just an absolute giant internationally in the field. And he actually called me on the phone, which just blew me away, and said that he wanted me to come to the University of Georgia. So I did. I was so impressed with that phone call, and that he would reach out to me, and that they actually wanted me to come to school there, that it just, I just forgot about every other place I had applied. And it turned out to be a great decision. It was a phenomenal faculty. Alan Kaufman and I ended up there the same year. He had left the Psychological Corporation, where he had been a senior research director, and he was the first person to ever revise a Wechsler scale. You know, he was in charge of creating the WISC-R from the WISC and worked directly with David Wechsler on that. And Alan was just brilliant, and also happens to be a phenomenal teacher. And so I was very fortunate and he actually knew who I was before I came there. Alan is a big baseball fan, and I played professional baseball. And what some people don't know is that Alan, they know about his works in school psychology and psychology, but Alan has also written books about baseball.
Oh.
And I will tell you that I'm quoted in places. In some of them. But so Alan knew who I was, and he wanted me as a student. So that was very fortunate for me because he was such a phenomenal mentor, and you just couldn't ask for a better mentor than him. But then Paul Torrance was there, and I worked for Alan as his graduate assistant during the academic year, and every summer I was there, I worked as a research assistant with Paul. And it's hard to imagine a better experience and better mentors than that. And that's really crucial to anybody's career, is establishing relationships with people who are real mentors. And then I happened to, because of my interest in neuropsychology, encountered Lawrence Hartledge. Of course, everybody else called him Larry. I called him Dr. Hartledge. And but I got to know Larry, and he invited me to come down and do an internship at the Medical College of Georgia, where he was head of neuropsychology. And his wife, Patricia Hartledge, was a pediatric neurologist. And she had established one of the first, at that time, pediatric neurology clinics in the United States. And Pat actually should be better known because she was the first female to be board certified in pediatric neurology in the United States. And so she was there. So I got to spend a great deal of time with just outstanding people. And that shapes your thinking, it develops your skills, and it keeps you challenged because all of these people were interested in providing the best possible services to kids and to moving all of that forward, and always asking, what do we need to know to do this better, and how do we go about creating that knowledge? And of course, Alan Kaufman also was talking about how do we develop better tools to work with kids. And so I had kind of always been interested in how we measure things, and so that just fit really well with me. And we just kind of took off from there. I got started in test development with my dissertation because I needed a really good anxiety measure for children for my dissertation and couldn't find one. So I built one and published it. And I was so busy doing that, and it took so long that I picked up an entirely different dissertation project because I couldn't build the test fast enough to use it in my dissertation. But I ended up publishing actually the Revised Children's Manifest Anxiety Scale, which was my first test while I was a graduate student. And it's just kind of where I've been with a lot of my research since then.
That's awesome, and that's so inspiring about what you're saying about having that mentor, and how exciting that there's been these people across your career and along your path that have helped. I'm sure that anybody looking back is really proud of their contribution to some of the contributions that you've made to our field. So that's,
well, I hope they are. They tell me they are. Of course. Alan is the only one of those folks who's still alive.
Wow.
And I do get a chance to visit with him occasionally. And he's always very gracious with his time with me. And I still feel like his student whenever I'm around him, and I'm grateful for that because I'm still learning from him.
wow.
That's amazing.
That's very cool. One of the things that jumped out at me when I was kind of reading up some information prior to this broadcast here is what you mentioned about the baseball, because I'm looking at the Wikipedia page, and so I'm just going to read a quote. So after graduating high school in 1969, turned down a presidential appointment, the United States Naval Academy by Richard Nixon. After being drafted by the New York Mets, he played on various minor league teams within the Mets organization, made 3 all-star teams in different leagues prior to career-ending injury. So it's like, so school psychology was kind of like the backup, like that was like plan B. Like I had this injury, so I'm going to go and like revolutionize the field of school psychology and other disciplines within psychology. It was just like floored me when I read that. I was like, wow.
Well, actually, as I mentioned, I really didn't have a plan B, and so I went to play ball right out of high school, and just figured that's what I was going to do. And the year of my first major league contract is when I had my career-ending injury in spring training, and I didn't know how to earn a living, so I went back and went to college. So, and then discovered school psychology because I wanted to work with young people. And so that became my plan B, but I actually didn't have a plan B until I realized I didn't know how to earn a living. And I knew college was in my future at that point.
Wow. Very, very cool. And maybe I feel a little bit guilty that I'm kind of like glad that you got injured. like that.
Well, they say whoever they are that everything happens for a reason, right? So it's turned out well. It's been a good journey, and I'm still on it, and it's still fun.
That's
I also, and before, sorry, I'm like hogging all the questions, I know, and again in my giddiness, and I'll let you guys jump in soon. But I also was reading too that you're involved in a number of APA divisions. I saw 1, 2, 3, I think 6, and then we're president of, it looked like 4 to me, like very varied across within psychology, very varied across those divisions of psychology.
Well, I've been because of my interest in neuropsychology, I got and the training I got from Larry Hartledge and his wife Pat in pediatric neuropsychology. I very early on got involved with the National Academy of Neuropsychology when it was a young organization and was really growing and trying to establish the practice of neuropsychology. So I gradually became president of that as I served on the board when we were really trying to get that organization rolling. And then it just naturally kind of fell into work with the Division of Clinical Neuropsychology of APA, but I had always been a member of Division 16, which is school psychology, and NASP, and actually had served on the NASP executive board at one time as well. But the areas where I've worked within APA all are associated with testing, assessment, and kids. So, I was able to direct the APA Division of Evaluation and Measurement for a year as president of that. And that was important too, because we have to have a good foundation in measurement and testing if we're going to be good at diagnosis in psychology. And that's kind of where I've thrown most of my emphasis, is in how do we evaluate kids and come up with the right diagnosis that can lead us to the right intervention. If you don't get the diagnosis right, chances are you won't get the intervention right. So I think there's a good sequence there for us to follow. So and then, of course, school psychology and the APA has a division of clinical child and adolescent psychology and a pediatric psychology division. So it's just kind of been very natural for me to flow around in those circles because they're all related to what we do. If you're working with kids who have emotional and behavioral issues or learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities, whatever. All of these areas are in some way contributing to what we do. And so I've kind of drifted around in those circles and have learned a great deal as a result of that. It's been important to my development to keep learning from those folks.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing.
I had a thought as you were sharing your history about how it seems probable that the natural grit that you had that made you an excellent athlete contributed to the grit that you had during your graduate training. And you did so much, as you mentioned. You don't maybe sleep as much as all of us, but I wonder what you think about the measurement of character traits such as grit. And I don't know if you're familiar with Angela Duckworth's work at all, but I just wondered what you think about that.
Well, I think I tend to think of it as conscientiousness. And there's a big literature on assessing conscientiousness. And it's actually, conscientiousness is one of the best predictors of vocational success. People who score high, it's of course one of the big five, and people who score highly on conscientiousness do well in whatever area they choose to apply themselves.
Right.
So I think that is important. But it's also important to do something that Paul Torrance talked about a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And not everybody agrees with this. Particularly nowadays, I see some people who for some reason disagree with something Paul said. But Paul always told gifted and talented children, he said, don't be afraid to fall in love with something and pursue it with passion.
Yeah.
He was constantly telling gifted and creative children that. And that's the other piece that goes with conscientiousness. If you really are going to be successful and make a contribution, I think this grit and conscientiousness will take you a long way. But you also need to be doing something that you love to do and have a passion about it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no substitute for that as far as I'm concerned.
Hmm. Well, clearly you have a passion for measurement. And I think, the benefit that we all reap in the profession is that when life gave you lemons, you made some pretty incredible lemonade. So,
well, thank you for that.
Yeah, I would love to ask a little bit about the RIAS and perhaps, given the IQ tests and the cognitive assessments that we had previously, the Wechsler and then the Woodcock-Johnson and perhaps even Alan Kaufman's KABC, what was the impetus between developing something a little different and perhaps what do you see as the benefits of the RIAS in comparison?
Well, to start at the beginning of that, I guess. Randy Camphouse, who's my co-author on the RIAS and also my co-author on all things Basque. Randy and I were graduate students together.
Okay.
At the University of Georgia. And we both worked under Alan. And just a little anecdote before I talk about how we decided to go into the RIAS. For folks who aren't familiar with it, let me tell you the names of some other folks that you will recognize who were graduate students all at the same time, all at the University of Georgia, all working with Alan Kaufman and Paul Torrance. Myself, Randy Camphouse, Jack Naglieri, Bruce Bracken, Patty Harrison, and David Mealer, who's actually now a congressman. And there's just a very long list of folks Sylvia Schellenberger, who's very well known in another area within school psychology. But it's Steve McCallum. I know I'm forgetting people, but it was an amazing cohort of people, and we all fed off of each other and all challenged each other, and that also was important. So I want to acknowledge that cohort of students.
Wow.
Amazing.
All at the same time, all with Alan and Paul. But Randy and I had worked together for some years, as you know, on things related to Basque. We started developing the Basque in 1987, and it was published originally in 1992. It's when the first Basque, the first version came out. And we both had learned all of our initial intelligence testing and intellectual assessment skills directly from Alan, and he's wonderful. But Randy and I always questioned some of the things about intelligence tests and whether or not they were really measuring intelligence in the best way possible. And we didn't like some of the motor confounds that we saw on tests. And just to give you some ideas about that, one of the things we know is that children who are referred for disabilities have fine motor deficits at 4 times the rate of kids in the general population. So if you have a timed or speeded task where they have to be nimble with their hands, like even something like block design, but you got to have those blocks aligned, right? There's that rule about how closely aligned they have to be. You may have a kid who solved that block design in their head, but it takes them 10 seconds longer to manipulate the blocks because of their fine motor speed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what's happening to their IQ during that time? Their measured IQ is going down. But it had nothing to do with their intellectual ability. Or maybe they're mildly distractible. So if we have something that's very speeded, minor little distractions can pull you away from that and slow you down. And slowing you down can really impact IQ across a series of tasks like that. So we didn't like that. We didn't like short-term memory being included as a component of IQ. And we felt like, we can do this better. We can also do it faster because, the Wechsler scales just kept growing. They kept getting longer and longer and longer. And then, of course, there's the Woodcock-Johnson, which, you can spend all day giving. So we weren't convinced that was the best use of a psychologist's time. If you wanted to measure intellectual ability, we knew how to do that. We knew how to do it really well. And it didn't have to take an hour and a half or 2 hours or longer. We could do that very effectively in a half an hour. So that was kind of where we were coming from in putting the REOPS together. If you want to know about a child's intelligence, then measure their intelligence. And then, once you've done a really good job with that, if you can do that in a half an hour, you've got much more time to spend measuring other things about the child that are important to getting to the right interventions. If you try to tease all these other things out of an intelligence test, one of the things we know is that doesn't work. I think you mentioned you've had Gary Canavez on. Mm-hmm. And I think Gary will tell you very quickly that subtest level analysis of intelligence test scores is worse than a waste of time. It's misleading. Mm-hmm. And so that literature had grown to the point where even though Randy and I were taught by Alan Kaufman, who was really the father of modern methods that are sound psychometrically for evaluating strengths and weaknesses in subtest profiles, where we had stopped teaching it because the literature said, hey, this doesn't work. It's not telling you what you thought it was telling you. So it wasn't a question of the soundness of the technique that Alan Kaufman developed psychometrically for how to do it. It became a question of the validity. What interpretations are appropriate to make of subtest level fluctuations in a child's performance on an intelligence test? And the research literature that started out with Paul McDermott, who is an incredible school psychologist, who is really has a pronounced understanding of measurement and statistics. And Paul started out looking at the stability of those profiles and found out that they were absurdly unreliable over time, that those subtest level patterns lack any stability whatsoever. But what's interesting is that the indexes and IQs are very stable. So it's a little bit of a paradox. How in the world can the indexes and IQs be stable over time if their subparts, the subtests that go into that, if their composite parts are not stable? And it has to do with the way error is partialed. And so we build composites because they have much greater reliability. When we break those composites down, we find that the composite parts are quite unreliable. And so when we go to interpret those, we're primarily interpreting error variance. And that lacks validity for drawing any conclusions about a child that are going to be useful to us over a period of even months. So we stick with the composites and the IQs. And if we're not trying to develop something that has, a mountain of subtests, so you can do this analysis where you come up with all the little cognitive pieces that you want to look at, then we can measure intelligence far more quickly. The other thing, if I'm going to backtrack for just a minute about subtests and their composites, because this is something that hasn't been talked about much, and I actually said something about it on one of the school psych web pages, Facebook pages the other day. What is a subtest score? A subtest score is a composite score of items. And so one of the popular things now still is to look at, say, an index or a composite on an IQ, for example, on a Wechsler, and say, oh, there's a lot of variability in the subtest scores. I'm not going to interpret that composite score. It's not valid. Well, that's an inappropriate statement of validity to start with, because validity refers to interpretations, not scores. But think about this. Then, if that's true, if there's variability among the part scores that make up a composite, so if there's variability in the subtests that go into making up an IQ, and therefore you should interpret the IQ, well, what about the variability in item scores that made up each subtest score? Then the same, by analogy, would be true of that. So we eventually end up having to interpret individual test items, which is incredibly unreliable. There's a reason why we have so many items on a subtest. We have to have all these composite parts to get a reliable composite score. And that's what items are for a subtest. So if we're going to apply that logic to an IQ, we have to take that logic all the way back to the individual items, and it doesn't hold up. So if we don't need to do that, we can measure intelligence very reliably, much more quickly. Now, one of the things that sometimes people will misinterpret about what I say about that is that we don't need to measure those other things about kids. And that's a misstatement. We absolutely do need to know lots of things about kids' intellectual profiles. We just can't beat reliable variance about them out of an individually administered intelligence test. Intelligence tests were not really designed to allow us to do that. They're very good at measuring intelligence, and that's what we should use them for. But if we want to know something about a child's visual perceptual skills, we should give a test of visual perception, not an intelligence test. There's this bizarre finding in psychology when we look at test and measurements that says that a test specifically designed to measure something typically measures it better than a test designed to measure something else. So if you want to know about intelligence, give an intelligence test. When we have a need to know about visual perceptual skills, for example, give a comprehensive test of that. Use the developmental test of visual perception, for example. If it's auditory, use the developmental test of auditory perception. If you want to know about memory, don't try to tease that out of an intelligence test. Give the test of memory and learning. Certainly don't give any other one, but be sure it's the test of memory and learning. But when we know what it is we want to know about kids, use tests that are designed to tell us those things. But if you spent 2 hours giving the intelligence test and another 2 hours interpreting it, you don't have time to do that. We don't have infinite amounts of time to spend with each child. In fact, that's why one of the reasons testing was invented anyway. I often tell people, and they don't always get it, but I often tell people there's nothing you can learn with a psychological test that you can learn without it, given sufficient time with a child. If I could follow a child around for 6 months and observe all of their interactions and watch how they deal with challenging tasks and watch their problem solving and how they interact with people, all the things they do for 6 months. I could learn everything about them that I can learn in a day from psychological tests. So which are we going to opt for? We have to. And tests really are a shortcut to that knowledge. But they're a good shortcut because they've been investigated. We know about psychometric properties. We know about reliability. We have good research on how to interpret the scores. And that's what validity refers to, by the way. Validity is not a characteristic of the test score. Validity is a characteristic of the interpretation of the test score. Either we interpret it correctly or we don't. So sometimes I hear people say, well, that score's not valid. And actually, if you read the 1998 and then subsequently the 2014 standards for educational and psychological testing, there's a sentence in that standard documents in both of those years that says it's inappropriate to refer to the validity of the test. And that's the standards document in the field that we should all be following. Yet still that shorthand pops up all the time when people think about, does this score have validity? And that's an improper way of thinking about it in modern assessment. Validity refers to the interpretation of the test score. Either we made the right interpretation or not. And a score can have many different interpretations. So the validity of interpretations that were being made from sub-test level analyses of IQ tests didn't hold up. It didn't tell us what we thought it told us. So that's really why the RIAS and the RIAS 2 exist. We decided to deal with our dissatisfaction with some of that, and we did away with motor in the assessment of intelligence. We did away with speed in the assessment of intelligence, and really went with the issue of intellectual power and uh, really try to take out some of the things that confound measuring intelligence. So we think the RIAS provides a purer measure of intelligence, if you will, with fewer confounds than most of the other intelligence tests that are out there. And it was interesting that when it came out, people criticized the fact that we only had 2 subtests per index. And now I just kind of laugh when I look around at other tests that have been revised and have come out since the RIAS and have gone to the 2 subtests per index model that we demonstrated was perfectly sound. It's really a psychometric question, and we answered that question. So it works very well. It works very well, and a lot of people were reluctant to pick up the RIAS, although it did fairly well, well enough that we were asked to create a second edition, and use of the RIAS jumped just over 500% from RIAS to RIAS 2. So it has become very popular, not only with school psychologists, but with clinical neuropsychologists and other assessment people around the country. So I get to see those numbers periodically, and I know it jumped over 500% from RIAS to RIAS 2. So there's something about that people have now found appealing. And I think it's having the time to do the other assessments with kids and getting the intellectual assessment with fewer confounds. So that may be more history of that than you wanted to hear, but
that was great. Personally, I speak for myself, I guess, but yeah, I appreciate that. We have sort of a running hashtag that we all kind of joke about on the school psych forums that go around called "Scatter Doesn't Matter." So
yeah,
we laugh about that. Like, what do you think the child got? 7 on block design, but 10 on something else, and so that, I think that really speaks well to that. And having spoken with Gary Canavez, as you mentioned, and he talked a lot about the actuarial interpretation sort of approach of know what your test really measures and interpret it accordingly. I like that validity comment that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I have been in the actuarialist camp for decades. So Gary comes out of that camp as well, and he was mentored by Marley Watkins, and, who's firmly established in that camp, and it's and they all trace their roots back, by the way, to Paul McDermott.
Okay.
And which is a great place to be rooted if you're an actuarialist. And
it's good. It really, Ryan McGill, who we had on as well, spoke a lot about focusing on not entering G-factor variance in what we're interpreting. So really moving away from the subtest level interpretation for that matter too. So
well, and the other part of it is, even if subtest level analysis did work, you still get better measurement of those same constructs by using tests specifically designed to measure them.
Right.
As opposed to using subtests off of an intelligence test, which are not going to have the internal consistency reliabilities. Even if they were stable over time, they don't have the internal consistency reliabilities that are adequate to support that, compared to comprehensive measures of those same constructs.
That makes sense.
And this might be opening a can of worms, and we've kind of talked about it at length, so you don't need to go into it too much. But then, what are your thoughts with LD identification, and then using? I know that subtests not reliable, not good to use. But people that use that profile model with the index scores to identify LD or not LD, where do you stand on that?
Well, of course, the index scores obviously are what I promote people using. As far as the more general question of identification of learning disabilities, I think the field of identification, or the aspect of the field that looks at identification of learning disabilities, is probably in the biggest mess right now in the history of learning disabilities. RTI was supposed to solve the problem of the discrepancy model. RTI is a method of diagnosis, and Sally Shewitz and I have written a couple of articles about this together, is just a bad idea. RTI as a model of prevention is an incredibly good idea and should be implemented, and everybody ought to be doing it. RTI as a model of diagnosis is just wrong. But even so, it's still a model of discrepancy, because when you look at RTI approaches to it, you're looking to see whether or not the child is discrepant in making progress, right? When you put the intervention in place, you're looking at generating basically a graph of progress, whether you graph it or use tables or however you look at it. You're fundamentally looking at a problem where you're establishing a discrepancy between the level of achievement you expect the child to get under the intervention and whether or not they get there or not. So it's in that sense a discrepancy model. It's just using different variables, and it takes IQ out of the equation. The other thing that I hear people say in that area is that intelligence is irrelevant to learning, which I find very difficult to comprehend, actually. I think we see that intelligence has a great deal to do with learning, but I had the opportunity to debate Dan Rashley and Mark Shin on that topic at an APA convention some years back. And I invited them at that time to introduce me to all the neurosurgeons they knew with IQs below 80. And since intelligence is irrelevant to learning. And so far they haven't come forward with any, and I continue to challenge them on that periodically. There are now, as you know, multiple models out there. The RTI model for diagnosing learning disabilities, which I've told you what I think of that. And then we have other models out there that some very bright people are promoting. And these models don't end up diagnosing the same kids. So it's really thrown the whole area of diagnosis into greater disarray than the discrepancy model did. One of the big problems with the discrepancy model was that people were not applying the same model from one school district to another. Well, how is it we solved that? Well, we created even more models that have more variance. So there are more discrepancies than ever in how children are being determined to be learning disabled. And how they're getting diagnosed in the schools used to be very, very similar to how they were diagnosed in private clinical settings. And now there's a tremendous gap or discrepancy, if you will, to keep using that word, between how the schools are looking at learning disability and how private practitioners are looking at learning disability. So it's really, I don't know a better word than mess out there in how we do that. And we're going to have to get our collective heads together in the profession and try to resolve this in some way that benefits kids. Because now you can throw your kid in the backseat of your car and drive from California to New York. And as you drive across the country, your kid is learning disabled, normal, learning disabled as you drive through, from one school district to another. And that doesn't make any sense. At least it doesn't to me. I think there needs to be consistency about that. Mm-hmm. And the only way to do that and to get there is get our collective heads together. There was, for example, when people were implementing discrepancy models for learning disability diagnosis in so many different ways under the original rules and regulations for IDEA that were in the original Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Finally, the federal government, after just a few years of that chaos, put together a task force to look at and examine how should severe discrepancy models be done. What is the right mathematical model and how should it be applied? And I'm very well acquainted with that task force because I chaired it. And we were able to come to a resolution. But what we didn't have was any authority to make people adopt a common model. And even though we published that model under the auspices of the task force, we actually published it in the Journal of Special Education back in 85, I think it was. And it became very, very widely adopted. It didn't become uniformly adopted. So the chaos continued because no one had the authority to say, this is a consensus model and now everybody's going to have to use it. And I don't know that we'll ever have anyone who has that authority in a political, since we're in a political system and schools are part of a political system. But we need to have another meeting of the minds and pull people together and come up with best practice recommendations, if you will, and as a consensus about, given what we know about learning disabilities now, here's the best way to identify them. And we haven't done that. Instead, we are more fractionated than ever. So I'm not a big fan of any of the models that we have. We're just too fractionated. I see strengths and weaknesses in all the models that have been proposed. And I think their progenitors would tell you that too. They all know their models have strengths and weaknesses, and they push their particular models saying, well, my model is the strongest of the models that are out there. But they all have their problems, and some of them are measurement problems. Cross-battery assessment, for example, has way more measurement problems than people think about. The actual measurement aspect of it itself, if we get down to the fundamental psychometrics, are hugely problematic, and those problems haven't been solved and aren't likely to be solved because it would be too expensive to gather the necessary data to solve those psychometric problems. So all of these models have problems, and we need to really pull a group together, and it's got to be a group that is pulled together by NASP, by APA, and by the federal government. They're going to have to weigh into that group as well and really examine this carefully and thoroughly. And I think we can reach a consensus on the best way to do this. But again, that consensus won't be forced on people. Nobody's going to have that kind of authority, but at least we can figure out what it is, come to consensus, and put it out there for people to use. And that would improve practice, I think, significantly. Because right now it's just far too fractionated, and it's just made a mess out of everything. And it's not just from state to state. It's one school district to another. Most of the state regulations allow multiple models for this, and it's because we don't have a consensus.
And school psych to school psych. I mean, I might be practicing in the same district, but qualify a kid, and my colleague down the street in the same district doesn't.
Yeah, looking at the same data wouldn't qualify. I mean, you see on some of the school psych Facebook pages and on the listserv, you can see some of the disagreement about this. And it's all because we're so fractionated. Mm-hmm. And it also has to do, to some extent, with training standards. in the field. You know, the training standards that we have are good, but they purposely allow tremendous variability from one training program to another in how much and specifically what folks are taught in particular areas. Take measurement, for example, which is something I would naturally talk about. The degree of measurement training among school psychologists is much less than it was when I was in school. When I was in school at Georgia, if you were getting a degree in school psychology, you took a year of statistics minimum, and then you took a minimum of 3 measurement courses, and none of that had to do with assessment. That was the measurement side. Then you took assessment classes where you learned how to administer, score, and interpret various psychological tests. But you had a minimum of a year of statistics and 3 measurement classes. And measurement and statistics are not the same thing. They're very much related, but they're different areas of practice. That's why APA Division 5 was called the Division of Evaluation, Measurement, and Statistics, because those are very different disciplines in many ways. And we don't have the strength of training in that now. When I was director of the school psych program at Texas A&M, all of our students followed a similar model. They had a minimum of a year of statistics and 3 measurement classes, and even that's been scaled back now. So there's so many demands with the knowledge explosion. There's so much more we have to know. And as neuropsychology has grown, as we talked about, a field that I also have a lot of interest and experience with, and I've been boarded as a general clinical neuropsychologist and also boarded in pediatric neuropsychology. The time to learn those things has to come from somewhere. And one of the things that's happened is they have scaled back on the statistics and measurement training of clinicians. And that includes school psychologists. When I say clinicians, I use that to include people who work with kids. Well, they could work with any kind of, they could be adults too. But in our context, I think about it, a clinician is somebody who's working with kids. And most clinicians now, whether they're school psych clinicians, child clinical clinicians, counseling psychology clinicians, whoever, aren't getting that level of training because of the demands of other areas that we need to know. And it's a tough balance to strike. We've got to know more now about the biology of behavior because there's so much more to know. And we've learned so much more about the links between our biology and our behavior than we knew before. And it's become more important. So that time has to come from somewhere. And they've taken it from stat measurement. So it's interesting to see some of the questions that come up sometimes on the Facebook pages and the listserv and some of the responses. And, I spend a lot of time biting my tongue about some of the measurement issues, but it's unrealistic to think that everybody, particularly when they're in the early years of their profession, can know all of this. You can't. It takes a lot of time, and and it takes time to keep up with it. It also changes. I haven't seen an estimate on this lately, but we used to see consistently estimates that the half-life of knowledge in psychology was about 7 years. And what that means is that half of everything you learned in graduate school was wrong. And it takes about 7 years for that to be discovered. So that's why we have continuing education, right? It turns about about half the things I taught people in graduate school were wrong. Well, we just didn't know it was wrong at the time. It was the best knowledge we had. But as we discover new things and we discover more about people and about psychology and about how all this works, we realize that certain things turned out not to be right, like subtest level analysis of intelligence test scores. I taught that for, close to 20 years.
Wow.
In great excruciating detail. You can ask some of my former students. They were really good at it by the time I got done with them. And then 20 years later, I said, you need to quit doing this.
You know, I feel like it's so hard for people to come to that realization that, what I've been doing is wrong. Like, to get over that cognitive bias and be like, okay, I need to do this differently. And I think that takes, like, it hurts. So,
it does. You're absolutely right. It's painful. But if we are going to engage in evidence-based practice, we've got to be willing to change. And I don't like changing any more than anybody else does. I get real comfortable with certain things that I do. And I get real comfortable, habits in my personal relationships. We all get comfortable with that. And we don't want to change, right? We want people to accommodate us. And that happens with our science. I get very comfortable with aspects of my science, and I don't want it to change. But the reality of it is, if I'm going to be a scientist practitioner, which we should all be, if you're going to have how you practice determined by the evidence, then you've got to be willing to change. You've got to be willing, when there's new data, to reach different conclusions. And otherwise, we're out of date in a hurry.
Yeah.
And that doesn't serve kids. If we're not keeping up with our science and we're not changing as the data change, we're not serving those kids. And ultimately, if you're a school psychologist, I assume you got into this profession because you want to habilitate children's development, their positive developmental features. You really want to habilitate the positive development of children. And the way to do that is to use evidence-based practices, things that our research says work and are effective. And that changes. But it is really hard sometimes to say, damn, I can't believe I shouldn't have been doing it that way. And here's a way to do it that's more effective. And now I got to change.
Yeah.
There's resistance to change. You are absolutely right.
So much of what you're saying resonates with me. I'm in my 6th year as a working school psychologist, so I figure I have about a year left of slightly knowing what I'm talking about before it's all. But one of the ways that I find so helpful to stay current on even what the debates are about what is still useful that we're doing and what needs to be changed is to listen to the debates online and on social media, because when people like you, and you're getting a lot of our viewer shout outs and love from different Facebook pages, says no school psychologist ever is represented here in our viewership, and very excited to be having this conversation with you.
Thank you for me. I appreciate that they're willing to listen.
Yes, it's just so incredible that there could be a question on the Basque and then Dr. Reynolds replies. It's amazing, just opportunity to really keep growing. And so before we get too entrenched as early career people in our practices and holding on too tightly to what our graduate school professors said, we can start to gather more information, because the time for workshops and professional development and continuing education is limited. And sometimes those workshops were developed at the same time you were, 5 years, 6 years ago anyway. So things that are new are not usually workshop ready right away.
It's a challenge to keep up. And as school psychologists, we have to keep up in so many different areas. That's incredibly challenging. Just think about all the kids you see who are taking some kind of psychoactive medication, and you have to know about those. Mm-hmm. If you're going to get the diagnostic picture correct, and you're going to put into place effective interventions at schools, you have to know what other interventions are going on. And with a lot of kids, it's psychoactive medications. And that field is moving so fast that just keeping up with that is a challenge. And then you have to keep up with new tests and new revisions. And then you have to keep up with all these debates that we've talked about today. Yeah. And you have to keep up with the changing school system. So it's an incredible challenge to keep up with all that and to keep up with the changes in what we're learning about the brain. Brain research is progressing so rapidly now. It's just amazing. And that's very hard to keep up with, just given that I practice forensic neuroscience. So I am constantly bombarded with neuroscience research. And even though that's my primary focus in practice, it's hard to keep up just with that. So I can't imagine now being a school psychologist in the schools and having to keep up with as many areas as you have to stay current with. And if I can help people with that in some areas, I'm happy to do it. But I think it's an incredible challenge to school psychologists. And one of the things that I've called for, actually, and I actually have a PowerPoint on this I'll share with some of you if you're interested. In a talk I gave some years back at APA is a call for specialization in school psychology. Mm. I think that having the school psychologist who knows everything about everything, which is kind of how we're looked at in a lot of ways, that time is over. That we need school psychologists who specialize in different areas of school psychology, because the breadth and depth of knowledge that we have to be successful is too great. So I think we need school psychologists who specialize, for example, in neuropsychology. I like the idea of school neuropsychologists. I like the idea of school psychologists who specialize in chronic disease, for example, is another one, and which is a lot of what pediatric psychologists do. But we can learn a lot from that and have school psychologists available within a district who really specialize in how chronic illnesses affect children and learning, and a lot of the specialized interventions for that. So those are just two examples. I think we need school psychologists who specialize in designing behavioral interventions, who don't do nearly as much on the assessment side, but can take the assessment information from other school psychologists who specialize in that and really design evidence-based behavioral interventions that can work in a school with this teacher, with this principal, with this kid in place. Because we know the same intervention, even though an intervention might be effective, it's not effective in every school with every teacher and every principal, because schools are their own little system. And what works in one may not work in another. But I think we need that level of specialization within school psychology if we're going to expect people to stay current and stay at the edge of the science in their area of specialization. I just think it's reached the point where it's too much for one school psychologist to be a specialist in all of those areas.
Yeah, we have lots of viewers sharing that they too wish we had specialization, and so many ideas on what kinds of specializations there could be.
Yeah, there are a lot. I just mentioned 3 or 4, but there certainly, if I said anything, I think I have more of them in my PowerPoint. I could come up with 8 to 10 areas fairly quickly.
Yeah. I do think that would be a great model, and someone just commented that would really force districts to have psych teams that function together. My one worry about that is that already some schools have school counselors and BCBAs and SLPs that work as the specialists, and I wonder, can we as school psychologists compete with those other specialties already? Should we, or can we?
Yeah, and I think it's how we compete best is to have school psychologists who specialize in different areas who would be part of that team. And you may end up with more than one school psychologist on a particular kid's team. But you could also, then to go back, for example, to the chronic illness model, if that would be a better psychologist probably to have on that kid's team, one who specializes in chronic illness, than our generalist model. So I think we could refine the services that we give the kids if we do that. And I think that we're going to have to specialize eventually if we're going to compete successfully to get kids the right services. And everybody thinks their specialty is the one that provides the best services, right? And the most valuable. You see that with SLPs and counselors, and we all want to think that what we do is important. But if we have an integrative model where all those areas of specialty are valued, and we put them in place at the right time with the right kids, it's going to make things better for those kids' lives. And that's really the key, because we do need teams. We do need teams because we have to have specialization. So there's no reason not to specialize in school psychology other than the current training standards don't really allow it at the non-doctoral level. At the doctoral level, it's easier to specialize because you're there for so much longer and you have more latitude in your choices of coursework. So, for example, as you mentioned about my background, when I was getting my PhD in school psychology, as part of our program at Georgia, you had a major and 2 minors if you were getting a doctoral degree. And my major was school psychology, but then I got to specialize with my minors. So I took a minor in statistics and a minor in clinical neuropsychology because those were areas that I really wanted to know a lot more about. So I got the general training in school psychology, but was able to delve into and specialize in some other areas. But at the non-doctoral level, there's no time for that. The generalist training takes precedent. And we're not getting, and adding another year to non-doctoral training in school psychology makes no sense because then you're so close to getting your doctorate. Why bother? I mean, you should go ahead and finish that doctoral level training if you're that close. But if we had models where people could specialize within school psychology, we could do that at the non-doctoral level. But we have to develop those training models. And right now, they're not in place very well. There are programs that certainly have different kinds of emphases, but they still have to produce school psychologists who are incredible generalists. And the intellectual demands of that, once you get into practice, I just think are phenomenal.
such good things to think about, and I want to thank you again for coming. I know you obviously you don't sleep because you have way too much going on, and so we're really appreciative that you spent some.
Well, I tell people I retired once, and it was the worst 20 minutes of my life.
It's a great discussion, and I think we hit on a lot of important things. I want to remind viewers we'll be back on October 7th to talk about executive functioning. And before we go, Dr. Reynolds, I wanted to just real quick a kind of a lighter question, so we end on something a little bit more fluffy, I guess maybe. But with fall coming up, School Psychology Awareness Week, there's a little bit of a some people on the forums and on the school said no school psychologists ever. This kind of why isn't it appreciation? Why is it instead awareness? And I just now got my communique in the mail, and there's a little article on why NASP has decided that it should be awareness and not appreciation, which I think can agitate some people. Are we just wasting time on silly stuff, or do you have a thought on should it be a school psych appreciation or school psych awareness?
Well, I still think it needs to be awareness. We certainly should be appreciated. I'm not opposed to that. But when I was an undergraduate majoring in psychology, it wasn't until I made a decision that I wanted to go to graduate school and started talking to people about, if I want to work with kids, what should I go into? That's when I found out there was such a thing as school psychology. And so I think school psychology is still not widely known as a profession and appreciated as being a profession. So we do have to have more awareness. I think if you look around, at the beginning of the year, I know you've seen this on some of the school psych Facebook and community pages, some of the titles that they stuck up on people's mailboxes, and even the people who work in the school don't know that it's a school psychologist.
Right.
They call them all kinds of things, and they get called counselors in the schools. They get all kind of names and labels stuck on the door and mailboxes, and so yeah, I think we still are in the awareness stage. Although I do think we should be appreciated too, because I'll tell you, school psychologists, as I've been saying, have a tough job for a lot of reasons. But one is just the intellectual advantages of being an effective school psychologist, I think, are tremendous.
Awesome. All right, we're gonna wrap up. I know my children are ready to bust down the stairs in a moment. So thank you so much for joining us. And
yes.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me on and for being so kind to me in the introductions and giving me good questions. I've enjoyed this.
Okay. Thank you. Are you going to be at NASP? Can we go and stalk you at NASP?
You can stalk me at NASP.
Yes.
I'm generally, it's not easy for me to hide. So I'm 6'4", have a beard, and I'm kind of a big guy. So
awesome.
You can generally find me.
We'll find you.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Bye. Thank you.